Barren Ranch Acres. Loretta Lori McGraw had spent years avoiding men like Jack Slade drifters with sharp grins and hands that knew too much. But when he pulled her into a darkened alley, his fingers rough and knowing, she forgot every warning. He smirked, his breath warm against her ear. "You keep looking at me like that, sweetheart," he murmured. "And I just might take it as an invitation." Chapter 1. The Widow of Whispering Pines. The dust swirled around Loretta McGraw's worn boots, a miniature, ochre-colored cyclone mirroring the turmoil within her. The wind, a constant, whispering presence in Whispering Pines, seemed to carry the ghosts of her past, rustling through the brittle leaves of the cottonwood trees that lined the creek bed. It had been 5 years since Thomas, her husband, had ridden out to mend a fence line and never returned, leaving her with a ranch too big, a heart too heavy, and a silence that screamed louder than any storm. She squinted at the horizon, the setting sun painting the sky in hues of fiery orange and bruised purple. The beauty of it, once a source of solace, now felt like a cruel mockery. Beauty remained, indifferent to her pain. The ranch, Whispering Pines, was a sprawling testament to generations of McGraws, a legacy she was now solely responsible for upholding. It was a burden that pressed down on her, heavy as the leaden sky before a winter storm. Lori, as everyone called her, was a woman built for resilience, not for loneliness. Her hands, calloused from years of wrangling horses and mending fences, were as capable as any man's. Her eyes, the color of a stormy sea after a squall, held a depth of sorrow that few dared to meet directly. Her hair, once the color of ripe wheat, was now streaked with silver, a testament to the years of hardship etched onto her soul. She wore it in a practical braid, tucked beneath a worn Stetson, a shield against the relentless sun and the prying eyes of the townsfolk. The townsfolk of Redemption, a fitting name if ever there was one, were a mixture of hard-working ranchers, opportunistic merchants, and the occasional drifter looking for a fresh start or a quick escape. They treated Lori with a mixture of pity and respect, the kind reserved for widows who had borne their grief with a quiet dignity that bordered on defiance. She knew they whispered about her, about the circumstances of Thomas's disappearance, about the rumors of foul play that had never been substantiated. The whispers were another layer of dust she had learned to live with, another burden she carried without complaint. She had received a letter that morning, a crisp, official-looking document from the land office in Denver. It was a notice, a thinly veiled threat, really, about overdue taxes and the looming possibility of foreclosure. The weight of it settled in her stomach like a cold stone. She'd been struggling to keep the ranch afloat, selling off cattle at a loss, taking on extra work mending saddles for the neighboring ranches. But it never seemed to be enough. The vultures, she thought bitterly, were circling. A rider appeared on the horizon, a silhouette against the fading light. Lori's hand instinctively went to the rifle leaning against the porch railing, a Winchester she had learned to use with deadly accuracy. As the rider drew closer, she recognized the familiar lanky frame of Jedediah, her foreman, a man as weathered and reliable as the ancient oak tree that stood sentinel over the ranch house. Jedediah dismounted with a groan, his joints protesting the long day in the saddle. He removed his hat, revealing a shock of white hair that contrasted sharply with his sun-bronzed face. "Afternoon, Miss Lori," he said, his voice a low rumble. "Jedediah," Lori replied, her voice tight with unspoken worry. "Anything?" He shook his head, his eyes filled with a weary resignation. "Nothing. No sign of those strays. I checked the north pasture, all the way to Devil's Gulch. They're gone, Miss Lori." Vanished into thin air. The news, though expected, hit Lori like a physical blow. Those strays represented a significant portion of her remaining herd, a lifeline she could ill afford to lose. "Damn it," she muttered, the word a soft explosion of frustration. Jedediah looked at her, his gaze filled with a quiet understanding. He'd been with the McGraws for over 30 years, had seen Thomas grow from a boy to a man, had witnessed Lori's transformation from a bright-eyed bride to a hardened widow. He knew the ranch, and its mistress, Better than anyone. We'll find them, Miss Laurie, he said, though his voice lacked conviction. We'll keep looking. Laurie forced a smile, a weak imitation of her former self. Thank you, Jedediah. I know you will. He nodded, his eyes lingering on her face, searching for a flicker of hope in the gathering gloom. He saw only exhaustion and a steely determination that refused to be extinguished. He knew that look. It was the look of a McGraw facing down a storm. As Jedediah headed towards the bunkhouse, Laurie turned back to the horizon, the last sliver of the sun disappearing below the distant mountains. The wind picked up, carrying the scent of dust and sage and the faint, haunting melody of a coyote's howl. She closed her eyes, letting the wind whip around her, a tangible reminder of the wild, untamed land she called home. A land that demanded everything and gave little in return. A land that had taken her husband and was now threatening to take everything else. She opened her eyes, her gaze fixed on the darkening sky. A single star, bright and defiant, pierced the encroaching night. It was a small spark of light in a vast expanse of darkness, a reminder that even in the deepest despair, there was still a flicker of hope. And Laurie McGraw, the widow of Whispering Pines, would cling to that flicker with every fiber of her being. She would fight for her ranch, for her legacy, for the memory of the man she had loved. She would fight until her last breath. But how could she fight against an unseen enemy, one that stole cattle in the night and threatened to steal her very soul? Chapter 2. Shadows in the Sunlit Mesa. The morning sun, a harsh, unforgiving glare, beat down on Laurie as she rode across the sun-baked mesa. The landscape, usually a breathtaking panorama of rolling hills and towering rock formations, seemed to press in on her, suffocating her with its vastness and indifference. The loss of the cattle weighed heavily on her mind, a constant, throbbing ache that overshadowed even the physical discomfort of the heat. She was headed towards redemption, a reluctant journey to the bank, to plead for an extension on her loan. It was a humiliation she dreaded, a public admission of her failing struggle. But she had no choice. The ranch was her life, her heritage, the only link she had left to Thomas. The town, as she approached, was a cluster of weathered wooden buildings huddled together against the vastness of the surrounding landscape. It was a place of hard-won survival, where fortunes could be made and lost on the turn of a card, or the whims of the weather. The saloon, the Golden Nugget, was the town's social hub, a place of boisterous laughter, whispered secrets, and the occasional eruption of violence. The general store, owned by the portly and perpetually sweating Mr. Henderson, was a repository of everything from flour and sugar to rifles and dynamite. And then there was the bank, a solid, imposing structure that stood in stark contrast to the rest of the town, a symbol of the financial power that held redemption in its grip. Laurie tied her horse, a sturdy Appaloosa named Spirit, to the hitching post outside the bank, her stomach twisting with a knot of apprehension. She smoothed down her worn riding skirt, a futile attempt to make herself presentable. She hadn't worn a proper dress in years, the practicalities of ranch life demanding a more utilitarian wardrobe. As she entered the bank, the cool, dimly lit interior offered a brief respite from the scorching heat. The air smelled of old money and polished wood. Mr. Abernathy, the bank manager, a thin, precise man with a perpetually disapproving frown, looked up from his ledger, his eyes narrowing behind his spectacles. "Mrs. McGraw," he said, his voice devoid of warmth. "To what do I owe this unexpected pleasure?" Laurie forced herself to meet his gaze, her chin held high. "Mr. Abernathy," she replied, her voice steady despite the tremor in her hands. "I've come to discuss my loan." He sighed, a sound that suggested he had been expecting this and dreading it. "Yes, Mrs. McGraw, your loan. It is, shall we say, in a rather precarious state." Laurie recounted the loss of the cattle, explained the difficulties she was facing, her voice pleading without her intending for it to show weakness. Abernathy listened, his expression unchanging, his fingers steepled beneath his chin. When she finished, he remained silent for a long moment, the only sound the ticking of the grandfather clock in the corner. "Mrs. McGraw," he said finally, his voice cold and final. "I understand your predicament. However, the bank is not a charitable institution. We have rules, procedures. Your loan is overdue. The collateral, your ranch, is insufficient to cover the outstanding debt." Lori's heart sank. She had known this was coming, but hearing the words spoken aloud felt like a death sentence. "I need more time," she pleaded, her voice cracking. "Just a few more months. I can sell more cattle, find other ways to." Abernathy shook his head, his lips pressed into a thin line. "I'm afraid that's not possible, Mrs. McGraw. The bank has already been generous. We have given you ample opportunity. I'm afraid I must insist on full payment within 30 days. Or," he paused, letting the unspoken threat hang in the air. "Or you'll foreclose," Lori finished for him, her voice barely a whisper. Abernathy nodded, his expression unyielding. "I'm afraid so, Mrs. McGraw. It's nothing personal, you understand. It's simply business." Lori stood there, frozen, the weight of his words crushing her. She had lost. She had failed. The ranch, her life, everything she had fought for, was slipping through her fingers like grains of sand. She turned and walked out of the bank, the bright sunlight blinding her after the dim interior. She felt numb, disoriented, as if she had stepped into a nightmare. She untied Spirit, her movements mechanical, her mind reeling. As she mounted her horse, she noticed a figure leaning against the wall of the saloon, watching her. It was a man she had seen around town a few times, a drifter, judging by his worn clothes and the way he carried himself, with a quiet confidence that bordered on arrogance. He had dark hair, a ruggedly handsome face, and eyes that seemed to pierce through her, seeing more than she wanted him to see. He was the man from the alley, the one from the kiss Jack slayed. He pushed himself off the wall and walked towards her, his steps slow and deliberate. Lori's heart quickened, a mixture of fear and something else, something she couldn't quite name. He stopped in front of her, his gaze locking with hers. "Heard you had a rough time in there," he said, his voice a low drawl, the words laced with a hint of amusement. His eyes crinkled slightly, and even thought his smirk was a reminder of that alley. This felt different. Lori bristled at his words, her pride stung. "It's none of your business," she retorted, her voice sharp. He raised an eyebrow, a flicker of something that might have been admiration in his eyes. "Maybe not," he said. "But I've got a nose for trouble. And you, Mrs. McGraw, look like you're neck deep in it." She glared at him, her hands tightening on the reins. "I don't need your help," she said, though the words sounded hollow, even to her own ears. He smiled, a slow, knowing smile that sent a shiver down her spine. "Maybe you don't," he said. "But maybe I need yours." His words, cryptic and unexpected, hung in the air between them, a challenge, a proposition, a hint of something dangerous and alluring. The shadows of the sunlit mesa seemed to deepen, and Lori McGraw felt a flicker of something she hadn't felt in years, a spark of intrigue, mixed with a healthy dose of apprehension. What did this drifter want? And why did she feel a pull, a dangerous, undeniable pull, towards him? Chapter 3. A stranger's touch, a familiar ache. The late afternoon sun cast long shadows across the dusty main street of Redemption as Lori and Jack Slade stood locked in a silent battle of wills. His presence was unsettling, a disruption of the carefully constructed walls she had built around her heart. He exuded a raw, untamed energy that both frightened and intrigued her. "What do you mean, you need my help?" Lori asked, her voice betraying a hint of curiosity despite her efforts to remain aloof. Jack leaned closer, his eyes, the color of dark whiskey, holding hers captive. "I hear things," he said, his voice a low murmur that sent a shiver down her spine. "Whispers on the wind, you might say. Whispers about missing cattle, about a widow struggling to hold onto her land, about a bank manager with a greedy heart." Lori stiffened, her guard rising. "You've been talking to people," she said, her tone accusing. He shrugged, a nonchalant gesture that belied the intensity of his gaze. "This is a small town, Mrs. McGraw. Secrets don't stay buried for long. He paused, letting his words sink in. I also hear things about your husband, Thomas. About how he disappeared. About how some folks believe it wasn't an accident. Lori's breath caught in her throat. The mention of Thomas, the raw wound that never fully healed, sent a fresh wave of pain through her. That's old news, she said, her voice tight with emotion. Gossip and speculation. Nothing more. Jack's expression softened, a flicker of something that might have been empathy in his eyes. Maybe, he said. But maybe there's more to the story than you know. Maybe someone doesn't want you to know the truth. Lori's mind raced. The possibility that Thomas's death hadn't been an accident had haunted her for years, a dark shadow that lurked in the corners of her mind. But she had pushed it aside, buried it beneath layers of grief and the daily struggle to survive. Could Jack Slade be telling the truth? Or was he simply playing on her vulnerabilities, using her pain for his own purposes? Why are you telling me this? She asked, her voice trembling slightly. What's in it for you? He smiled, a slow, enigmatic smile that revealed a hint of danger. Let's just say I have my reasons, he said. And those reasons, they might align with yours. I need a place to stay, a place to lay low for a while. Your ranch, it's isolated, secluded. It suits my needs. Lori's eyes narrowed. You want to work for me? She asked, her tone skeptical. A drifter like you? What can you offer me? He stepped closer, his proximity sending a jolt of awareness through her. She could smell the scent of leather and dust and something else, something wild and untamed, that stirred a long-dormant part of her. I can offer you protection, he said, his voice low and husky. Protection from those who might want to take what's yours. Protection from the shadows that haunt your past. His words, though seemingly outrageous, resonated with a deep-seated fear she had tried to ignore. The loss of the cattle, the threat of foreclosure, the lingering questions about Thomas's death, they all pointed to something sinister, something lurking beneath the surface of her seemingly ordinary life. And in return? She asked, her voice barely a whisper. He reached out, his hand hovering just inches from her cheek. Lori held her breath, her heart pounding in her chest. His fingers, rough and calloused, gently brushed a stray strand of hair from her face. The touch, brief and unexpected, sent a wave of heat through her, a sensation she hadn't felt in years. It was a touch that spoke of danger, of intimacy, of a connection that defied logic and reason. In return, he said, his voice a low murmur that seemed to vibrate through her very bones. I ask for your trust, and maybe a chance to earn it. The ache in Lori's heart, the familiar ache of loneliness and loss, mingled with a new sensation, a flicker of hope, of desire, of something she had thought long dead. She looked into his eyes, searching for any sign of deception, of ulterior motives. But all she saw was a raw intensity, a vulnerability that mirrored her own. Against her better judgment, against every warning bell ringing in her head, she found herself nodding. All right, Mr. Slade, she said, her voice surprisingly steady. You have a deal. But understand this, she added, her gaze hardening. You cross me, you betray my trust, and you'll regret it. I may be a widow, but I'm not weak. He smiled, a genuine smile this time, that reached his eyes and softened his features. I wouldn't have it any other way, Mrs. McGraw, he said. I wouldn't have it any other way. As they rode out of town together, the setting sun casting long shadows behind them, Lori couldn't shake the feeling that she had just made a pact with the devil. But it was a devil she desperately needed, a devil who might just be her only salvation. And as his hand brushed hers, seemingly by accident, while they adjusted their horses, a spark ignited, a dangerous, undeniable spark that threatened to consume them both. The familiar ache remained, but now it was intertwined with something new, something terrifying and exhilarating all at once. Chapter 4. Echoes of Gunfire and Regret. The ride back to Whispering Pines was filled with a tense silence, punctuated only by the rhythmic creak of saddle leather and the occasional snort of the horses. Lori, acutely aware of Jack Slade's presence beside her, struggled to reconcile the conflicting emotions swirling within her. Fear, apprehension, and a flicker of something akin to hope warred within her heart. As they approached the ranch, the familiar sight of the sprawling homestead, nestled amidst the rolling hills, brought a pang of bittersweet longing. It was a place of beauty and hardship, of love and loss, a place that held both her fondest memories and her deepest sorrows. Jedediah, ever vigilant, met them at the corral, his eyes narrowed with suspicion as he took in the sight of the stranger riding alongside his mistress. Lori introduced Jack, her voice carefully neutral, explaining that he would be working on the ranch, helping with the missing cattle and other chores. Jedediah's expression remained guarded, his years of experience making him wary of outsiders. "He's a good hand, Jedediah," Lori said, trying to reassure him, though she wasn't entirely convinced herself. "He's experienced." Jedediah grunted, his gaze fixed on Jack. "We'll see about that," he muttered, his voice a low rumble. Jack, unfazed by Jedediah's hostility, simply nodded, his eyes conveying a quiet confidence. "I'll earn my keep," he said, his voice calm and steady. After settling their horses, Lori led Jack to the main house, a modest but sturdy structure built of logs and stone. The interior was simple but comfortable, furnished with well-worn furniture, handcrafted rugs, and the accumulated possessions of generations of McGraws. The air smelled of wood smoke and beeswax, a familiar scent that always brought Lori a sense of comfort. She showed him to a spare room, a small, sparsely furnished space at the back of the house. "It's not much," she said, her voice apologetic.
"But it's clean and dry."
Jack glanced around the room, his eyes taking in the simple cot, the worn dresser, and the single window that overlooked the sprawling landscape. "It's more than enough," he said, his voice surprisingly gentle. As Lori turned to leave, he stopped her, his hand gently touching her arm. "Mrs. McGraw," he said, his voice low and earnest. "I know you're taking a risk on me. I appreciate it. I won't let you down." Lori looked into his eyes, searching for any sign of insincerity. She saw only a raw honesty, a vulnerability that mirrored her own. "I hope not, Mr. Slade," she said, her voice softer than she intended. "For both our sakes." Later that evening, after a simple supper of beans and cornbread, Lori sat on the porch, watching the stars emerge in the vast, inky sky. The silence of the night was broken only by the chirping of crickets and the distant howl of a coyote. She felt a deep sense of unease, a premonition of trouble brewing on the horizon. She heard footsteps behind her and turned to see Jack standing in the doorway, his silhouette outlined against the warm glow of the lamplight. He joined her on the porch, his presence a silent, comforting weight beside her. "Can't sleep?" he asked, his voice a low murmur. Lori shook her head. "Too much on my mind," she replied, her gaze fixed on the distant stars. He nodded, his eyes understanding. "I know the feeling," he said. He paused, then added, "You loved him very much, didn't you? Your husband." Lori's breath caught in her throat. The question, unexpected and intimate, brought a fresh wave of grief. "Yes," she whispered, her voice choked with emotion. "I loved him more than words can say." Jack was silent for a long moment, his gaze fixed on the horizon. "I lost someone too," he said finally, his voice barely audible. "A long time ago. Someone I cared for deeply." Lori turned to him, surprised by his confession. She had seen him as a hardened drifter, a man of secrets and shadows. But in that moment, she saw a glimpse of the pain he carried, a pain that mirrored her own. "What happened?" she asked, her voice soft with empathy. He hesitated, then said, "She was taken from me. By someone I trusted. Someone I thought was a friend." He clenched his fist, his knuckles white. "I vowed to find him, to make him pay. But he vanished, like a ghost in the wind." His words, filled with bitterness and regret, echoed Lori's own feelings of loss and betrayal. She understood his pain, his desire for justice, his yearning for closure. "I'm sorry," she said, her voice sincere. He looked at her, his eyes filled with a raw vulnerability. Sometimes, he said, his voice hoarse, the echoes of the past, they never truly fade. They haunt you, follow you, like a shadow you can't escape. As he spoke, a sudden sound shattered the stillness of the night, a distant gunshot, echoing across the plains. Lori's heart leaped into her throat. She and Jack exchanged a look of alarm, their eyes locking in a silent understanding. The shadows of whispering pines had just deepened, and the echoes of gunfire were a chilling reminder that the past and its dangers were never far away. And in that moment, Lori knew, with cold certainty, the trouble was just beginning. Chapter 5. The Price of Silence, the Cost of Truth. The gunshot, a sharp, violent crack in the stillness of the night, sent a jolt of adrenaline through Lori and Jack. They raced towards the sound, their boots pounding on the hard-packed earth, their hearts pounding in their chests. Jedediah, alerted by the noise, joined them, his rifle in hand, his face grim. They found the source of the disturbance near the north pasture, where the missing cattle had last been seen. A single cow lay dead, its body sprawled on the ground, a bullet hole in its side. The air was thick with the coppery scent of blood. "Damn it," Jedediah muttered, his voice filled with anger and frustration. "They're not just stealing them anymore. They're killing them." Lori knelt beside the dead cow, her hand gently touching its still warm flank. A wave of despair washed over her. This wasn't just about the financial loss anymore. It was a deliberate act of cruelty, a message, a threat. Who would do this? She asked, her voice trembling.
Why?
Jack scanned the surrounding landscape, his eyes narrowed, his senses alert. He was like a predator, searching for any sign of his prey. "Someone who wants you to give up," he said, his voice low and hard. "Someone who wants you to leave Whispering Pines." Jedediah nodded in agreement. "It's the Barstow brothers," he said, his voice filled with certainty. "They've been eyeing this land for years. They're the only ones ruthless enough to do something like this." The Barstow brothers, Caleb and Silas, were notorious ranchers known for their aggressive tactics and their disregard for the law. They owned a large spread bordering Whispering Pines and had long coveted the McGraw land, with its access to the best water sources in the area. Lori had heard rumors of their ruthlessness, but she had never had any direct dealings with them.
Until now.
"We need to report this to the sheriff," Lori said, her voice rising with determination. "This is beyond a simple land dispute. This is murder." Jedediah snorted. "Sheriff Thompson? He's in the Barstow's pocket. He won't do anything. He'll just make things worse." Lori knew Jedediah was right. Sheriff Thompson was a corrupt, lazy man, more interested in lining his own pockets than in upholding the law. He was known to turn a blind eye to the Barstow's misdeeds in exchange for a share of their ill-gotten gains. Jack stepped forward, his eyes gleaming with a dangerous light. "Then we'll handle this ourselves," he said, his voice calm but firm. "We'll find out who's behind this, and we'll make them pay." Lori looked at him, her heart filled with a mixture of fear and admiration. She knew he was right. They couldn't rely on the law, not in this town, not with this sheriff. They had to take matters into their own hands. But the thought of confronting the Barstow brothers, of engaging in a potentially deadly conflict, terrified her. "What do you suggest?" she asked, her voice barely a whisper. Jack's gaze was intense, unwavering. "We start by gathering information," he said. "We talk to people, we listen to the whispers, we watch for any sign of unusual activity. And we prepare for a fight. Because if the Barstows are behind this, they won't back down easily." He turned to Jedediah. "You know the Barstow Ranch better than anyone," he said. "You know their routines, their weaknesses. We'll need your help." Jedediah nodded, his expression grim but resolute. "I'm in," he said. "I've had enough of those bastards. It's time they learned a lesson." Over the next few days, Lori, Jack, and Jedediah worked together, gathering information, piecing together the puzzle of the missing cattle and the escalating violence. They spoke to neighboring ranchers, to the townsfolk, to anyone who might have information about the Barstows' activities. They discovered a pattern of intimidation, of threats, of subtle sabotage, all aimed at driving Lori off her land. They also learned more about Thomas's disappearance. A few people, hesitant to speak at first, hinted at foul play, at a possible connection to the Barstows. They spoke of a heated argument between Thomas and Caleb Barstow, just days before Thomas disappeared. They spoke of rumors, of whispers, of a conspiracy of silence that had shrouded the truth for years. The price of silence was the fear that gripped the town. The cost of truth was a bullet in the night. Lori felt the weight of both, the fear for her own life, the cost of uncovering the truth about Thomas. As the pieces of the puzzle began to fall into place, Lori realized that she was facing a far greater danger than she had ever imagined. She was not just fighting for her ranch, she was fighting for her life, and for the truth about the man she had loved. And she knew, with a growing certainty, that Jack Slade, the enigmatic drifter with a haunted past, was the only one she could trust to help her survive. But could she truly trust him? The doubt lingered, a shadow as persistent as the setting sun. Chapter 6. Beneath the gaze of a hawk's shadow. The days that followed were a blur of activity, a tense dance between gathering information and preparing for the inevitable confrontation. Lori, Jack, and Jedediah spent hours riding the range, searching for any sign of the missing cattle, any clue that might lead them to the Barstows. The vast, unforgiving landscape seemed to watch them, its silence both ominous and revealing. One afternoon, while scouting a remote canyon known for its hidden springs, they came across a set of fresh tracks hoofprints, too many to be wild horses, leading towards the Barstow Ranch. Jack dismounted, examining the tracks closely, his eyes narrowed in concentration. "These are our cattle," he said, his voice grim. "They've been driven this way recently, within the last day or two." Lori felt a surge of anger and determination. This was proof, concrete evidence of the Barstows' involvement. "We need to follow them," she said, her voice firm. "We need to see where they're taking them." Jedediah hesitated. "It's risky, Miss Lori," he said. "The Barstows have men posted all over their land. We'll be outnumbered, outgunned." Jack nodded in agreement.
"He's right," he said.
"We need a plan. We can't just ride in there blindly." They spent the rest of the day discussing their options, weighing the risks and benefits of different approaches. Lori, despite her fear, was determined to confront the Barstows, to demand the return of her cattle, to expose their crimes. But she also knew that a reckless approach could be disastrous. As the sun began to set, casting long shadows across the canyon walls, they decided on a plan. They would approach the Barstow Ranch under cover of darkness, using their knowledge of the terrain to their advantage. They would observe, gather intelligence, and, if possible, retrieve some of their cattle. But they would avoid a direct confrontation unless absolutely necessary. As they rode back to Whispering Pines, Lori couldn't shake the feeling of being watched. She glanced up at the sky and saw a hawk circling overhead, its sharp eyes scanning the landscape below. It was a majestic creature, a symbol of freedom and power, but also a predator, a reminder of the constant struggle for survival in this harsh land. That night, Lori found it difficult to sleep. Her mind was racing, replaying the events of the past few days, imagining the dangers that lay ahead. She tossed and turned, her dreams filled with images of violence and loss. She heard a soft knock on her door and opened it to find Jack standing there, his expression concerned. "Can't sleep?" he asked, his voice gentle. Lori shook her head. "I'm worried," she admitted. "About tomorrow." "About everything." He nodded, his eyes understanding.
"I know," he said.
"But we'll face it together. We'll get through this." He stepped closer, and for a moment, Lori thought he was going to embrace her. But he hesitated, his hand hovering just inches from her arm. The tension between them was palpable, a mixture of fear and attraction, of shared vulnerability and unspoken desire. I should get some rest," Lori said, her voice trembling slightly. He nodded, his gaze lingering on her face. "Good night, Lori," he said, his voice husky. As she closed the door, Lori leaned against it, her heart pounding in her chest. She felt a strange mixture of relief and disappointment. She was drawn to Jack, to his strength, his protectiveness, his quiet understanding. But she was also afraid of letting down her guard, of allowing herself to feel anything for another man. She looked out the window, at the vast, star-studded sky. The hawk she had seen earlier was gone, but she could still feel its presence, its watchful gaze, a reminder of the dangers that lurked in the shadows. She knew that the next day would be a test, a trial by fire. She would have to face her fears, confront her enemies, and fight for what was rightfully hers. And she would have to do it with a man she barely knew, a man who carried his own secrets, his own demons. The hawk's shadow, though unseen, felt heavy upon her, a premonition of the challenges to come, and a silent question mark hanging over the trust she was slowly placing in Jack Slade. Chapter 7. Scars that whisper, wounds that bind. The moon, a sliver of silver in the inky sky, provided scant illumination as Lori, Jack, and Jedediah rode towards the Barstow Ranch. The night was cool, the air still, the silence broken only by the soft thud of the horses' hooves and the occasional hoot of an owl. The tension was palpable, a thick, heavy blanket that wrapped around them. They approached the ranch cautiously, using the cover of darkness and their knowledge of the terrain to their advantage. They dismounted a short distance from the main house, tying their horses to a cluster of scrub oaks, their movements silent and deliberate. "Jedediah, you stay here with the horses," Jack whispered, his voice barely audible. "Be ready to move if things go south." Jedediah nodded, his hand resting on the butt of his rifle. "I'll be here," he said, his voice grim. Lori and Jack crept closer to the ranch, using the shadows of the outbuildings and corrals to conceal their movements. They could hear the sounds of activity from within the main house: laughter, music, the clinking of glasses suggesting a late-night gathering. They circled around the back of the house, finding a vantage point that offered a view of the corrals and the surrounding pastures. In the dim moonlight, they could see a large herd of cattle, far more than the Barstows were known to own. Lori recognized some of her own animals, their brands clearly visible in the moonlight. "There they are," she whispered, her voice tight with anger. "They've got our cattle." Jack nodded, his eyes narrowed. "And more," he said. "They've been rustling from other ranches too. This is bigger than we thought." As they watched, two men emerged from the main house, their voices raised in drunken argument. Lori recognized them as Caleb and Silas Barstow, their faces flushed with alcohol, their movements unsteady. "I told you, Silas," Caleb slurred, his voice loud and aggressive. "We need to get rid of that McGraw woman. She's becoming a problem." Silas, the younger and slightly less drunk of the two, shook his head. "We can't just kill her, Caleb," he said. "That'll bring the whole damn territory down on us." Caleb laughed, a harsh, humorless sound. "We'll make it look like an accident," he said. "Just like we did with her husband." Lori's breath caught in her throat. She felt a cold hand of dread grip her heart. She had suspected the Barstows were involved in Thomas's death, but hearing it confirmed, hearing them speak of it so casually, so cruelly, filled her with a rage she had never known before. Jack placed a restraining hand on her arm, sensing her fury. "Easy, Lori," he whispered. "We need to stay calm. We need to get out of here. Report this to..." He stopped mid-sentence, his eyes fixed on something behind Lori. She turned and saw a figure emerging from the shadows, a man holding a rifle, his face obscured by the darkness. It was one of the Barstows' ranch hands, alerted by their presence. "Hold it right there," the man shouted, his voice rough.
"Who are you?"
"What are you doing here?" Jack reacted instantly, drawing his pistol and firing a shot that went wide, intentionally missing the man but forcing him to take cover. "Run, Lori," he shouted. "Get back to the horses." Lori, her heart pounding in her chest, turned and ran, scrambling through the darkness, her boots slipping on the loose gravel. She could hear the sounds of pursuit behind her: shouts, gunshots, the thud of running feet. She reached the horses, where Jedediah was waiting, his rifle raised, his face tense. "What happened?" he asked, his voice urgent. "They saw us," Lori gasped, her breath coming in ragged gasps. "They know we're here." They mounted their horses and rode away from the ranch, the sounds of pursuit fading behind them. They rode for hours, pushing their horses to their limits until they reached the relative safety of a secluded canyon. They dismounted, their bodies aching, their minds reeling. Lori, exhausted and shaken, leaned against a rock, her hands trembling. Jack examined a long, shallow gash on his arm, a souvenir from a near miss with a Barstow bullet. "We need to tend to that," Lori said, seeing the blood. She retrieved a small, worn leather pouch from her saddlebag, her emergency kit, containing bandages, herbs, and other necessities. She gently cleaned the wound, her touch surprisingly tender, her hands steady despite the turmoil within her. As she worked, their fingers brushed, and a spark of awareness passed between them. The scars on his body, both old and new, whispered stories of a life lived on the edge, a life of violence and hardship. And Lori's own wounds, both visible and invisible, seemed to resonate with his, creating a bond of shared pain, of shared resilience. The physical closeness, the shared danger, the whispered confession of the Barstows, all of it bound them closer, weaving a fragile tapestry of trust in the heart of a dangerous night. Chapter 8. Between the Law and the Lawless Heart. The first rays of dawn painted the canyon walls in hues of pink and gold, a stark contrast to the darkness of the night before. Lori, Jack, and Jedediah, exhausted but alive, prepared to ride back to Whispering Pines. The events of the previous night had solidified their resolve, but also heightened the sense of danger. "We need to go to the authorities," Lori said, her voice firm despite her exhaustion. "We have proof now. We heard them confess. They admitted to killing Thomas." Jedediah snorted derisively. "Sheriff Thompson? He's as crooked as a dog's hind leg. He's in the Barstow's pocket, always has been. We'd be wasting our time and putting ourselves in more danger." Jack nodded in agreement. "Jedediah's right. Thompson won't help us. He'll probably warn the Barstows, give them time to cover their tracks." He paused, his eyes thoughtful. "We need to find someone we can trust, someone outside of redemption, someone with the power to bring the Barstows to justice." Lori considered their options. The nearest town of any size was Silver Creek, a day's ride to the east. It was a larger, more prosperous town, with a reputation for a more honest, less corrupt law enforcement. But going there would mean leaving Whispering Pines vulnerable, exposing it to further attacks from the Barstows. "I can't leave the ranch," Lori said, her voice filled with anxiety. "They'll burn it to the ground if they know I'm gone." Jack placed a reassuring hand on her arm. "We'll figure something out," he said. "We always do." His gaze held a mixture of determination and something else, something that looked a lot like care, a depth of feeling that both comforted and unnerved her. They decided on a compromise. Jedediah would stay at Whispering Pines, protecting the ranch and keeping a watchful eye on the Barstows' activities. Lori and Jack would ride to Silver Creek, seeking help from the authorities there. It was a risky plan, but it was their best hope. The ride to Silver Creek was long and arduous, the landscape vast and unforgiving. Lori and Jack rode in silence for much of the way, their thoughts consumed by the dangers they faced and the uncertain future that lay ahead. As they rode, Lori found herself studying Jack, observing the way he sat his horse, the way he scanned the horizon, the way he seemed to be constantly alert, constantly prepared for trouble. She was drawn to his strength, his resilience, his quiet confidence. But she also sensed a deep sadness within him, a hidden pain that he kept carefully concealed. "You said you lost someone," Lori said, breaking the silence. "Someone you cared for deeply. What was her name?" Jack hesitated, his eyes clouding over with a mixture of pain and regret. "Sarah," he said, his voice barely a whisper. "Her name was Sarah." He told her the story, haltingly at first, then with a growing intensity, as if the words were a dam bursting within him. He spoke of his life before he became a drifter, of his time as a lawman in a small town in Texas. He spoke of Sarah, his fiancée, a beautiful, spirited woman who had brought light and joy into his life. He spoke of the day she was killed, caught in the crossfire of a bank robbery, a robbery orchestrated by a man Jack had trusted, a man he had considered a friend. Lori listened, her heart aching for him, for the pain he had endured, for the loss that had shaped his life. She understood his bitterness, his cynicism, his distrust of authority. She also understood his desire for justice, his need to make things right. "I'm so sorry, Jack," she said, her voice filled with empathy. "I understand now. Why you're so driven.
Why you want to help me?"
He looked at her, his eyes filled with a raw vulnerability.
"It's not just about you, Lori," he said.
"It's about righting a wrong. About making sure that the guilty pay for their crimes. It's about finding some kind of peace, some kind of redemption." His words resonated deeply within her, echoing her own desires, her own longing for justice and closure. She realized that they were more alike than she had thought, two wounded souls, bound together by shared pain, by a shared determination to fight for what was right. The line between the law they sought and the lawless hearts they carried was blurred, yet in that blurring, a connection was forged, a bond that transcended the dangers they faced. They were riding toward a potential solution, but also riding deeper into the tangled web of their shared and separate pasts. Chapter 9. The Dance of Deception and Desire. Silver Creek was a bustling town, a stark contrast to the sleepy isolation of Redemption. The streets were crowded with people, wagons, and horses, the air filled with the sounds of commerce and activity. Lori and Jack, dusty and weary from their long ride, felt a mixture of relief and apprehension as they entered the town. They found the sheriff's office, a solid, imposing building that exuded an air of authority. Sheriff Harding, a tall, imposing man with a stern face and a no-nonsense demeanor, listened to their story with a mixture of skepticism and concern. He asked pointed questions, scrutinized their evidence, and seemed to weigh their words carefully. "The Barstow brothers are powerful men," he said, his voice grave. "They have influence connections. Accusing them of murder, of rustling, is a serious matter." Lori, her voice trembling with emotion, recounted the events of the previous night, her voice shaking as she relayed Caleb Barstow's confession. Jack, his voice calm and steady, corroborated her story, adding details, providing context, his presence a reassuring force beside her. Sheriff Harding listened intently, his eyes never leaving their faces. When they finished, he remained silent for a long moment, his fingers steepled beneath his chin. "I believe you," he said finally, his voice firm. "I've heard rumors about the Barstows, whispers of their misdeeds. But rumors are not enough. I need proof, concrete evidence that will stand up in court." He agreed to send a deputy back to Redemption with Lori and Jack to investigate the situation, to gather evidence, to assess the threat posed by the Barstows. But he warned them that it would be a difficult task, that the Barstows were not to be underestimated. The deputy, a young, eager man named Thompson, no relation to the corrupt sheriff of Redemption, was assigned to accompany them. He seemed honest and dedicated, a refreshing change from the law enforcement Lori had encountered in her own town. Before leaving Silver Creek, Lori and Jack decided to spend the night at the local hotel, a welcome respite from the hard ground and the constant tension of the past few days. The hotel, a modest but comfortable establishment, offered a sense of normalcy, a brief escape from the dangers that awaited them back at Whispering Pines. They shared a quiet dinner in the hotel dining room, their conversation subdued, their thoughts consumed by the challenges ahead. Lori found herself increasingly drawn to Jack, to his strength, his quiet confidence, his unwavering support. But she also sensed a wall around him, a barrier that he kept carefully in place, a protection against further pain and loss. After dinner, they stood on the hotel balcony, overlooking the bustling street below. The night air was cool, the sounds of the town a soothing backdrop to their silent contemplation. "Thank you, Jack," Lori said, her voice soft. "For everything. For believing me, for helping me, for being here." He turned to her, his eyes filled with a mixture of tenderness and regret. "I told you," he said, his voice husky. "I have my reasons." He reached out, his hand gently touching her cheek. The touch, brief and unexpected, sent a wave of heat through her, a sensation that both thrilled and frightened her. She had not allowed herself to feel such things since Thomas's death, had built walls around her heart, protecting herself from further pain. But Jack's touch, his presence, his unwavering support, were slowly chipping away at those walls, revealing a vulnerability, a longing, that she had tried to bury for years. The dance of deception they were engaged in with the Barstows was mirrored by the dance of desire that was slowly, tentatively, beginning between them. Each step forward was fraught with danger, each glance held a hidden meaning, each touch a spark that threatened to ignite a fire they might not be able to control. He leaned closer, his breath warm against her ear. "Laurie," he whispered, his voice a low murmur that sent shivers down her spine. The moment stretched, filled with unspoken desires, with the weight of their shared burdens, with the uncertainty of their future. And as his lips brushed against hers, a tentative, questioning touch, Laurie knew that she was falling for a man who was as dangerous as he was captivating, a man who could be her salvation or her destruction. Chapter 10. Where Rivers Run Red with Secrets. The kiss, a brief, hesitant meeting of lips, lingered in the cool night air, a silent acknowledgement of the growing connection between Laurie and Jack. It was a kiss that spoke of shared pain, of unspoken desires, of a tentative trust that was slowly blossoming in the midst of danger. They pulled apart, their eyes locking in a gaze that was both intense and uncertain. Laurie's heart was pounding, her mind reeling. She had not expected this, had not allowed herself to even consider the possibility of such a connection. But the reality of it, the raw, undeniable attraction, was impossible to ignore. "Jack," she whispered, her voice trembling. I don't know what to say." He smiled, a gentle, understanding smile that softened his features.
"You don't have to say anything, Laurie," he said. "Not now.
Not yet." They returned to their separate rooms, the silence between them thick with unspoken emotions. Laurie lay awake for hours, her mind replaying the kiss, the feel of his lips on hers, the warmth of his breath against her skin. She was torn between her growing feelings for Jack and the lingering grief she still felt for Thomas, between the desire for a new beginning and the fear of betraying her past. The next morning, they set off for Whispering Pines, accompanied by Deputy Thompson. The ride was tense, the sense of danger heightened by the knowledge that they were returning to a potentially explosive situation. The Barstows would know they had been to Silver Creek, would know that they were seeking help from the authorities. They would be prepared, waiting, their hostility amplified. As they approached Whispering Pines, they noticed a plume of smoke rising in the distance, a dark, ominous cloud against the clear blue sky. Laurie's heart leaped into her throat. "The ranch," she gasped. "They've set fire to the ranch." They spurred their horses, racing towards the source of the smoke, their fears growing with every stride. As they drew closer, they saw that it wasn't the main house that was burning, but one of the outbuildings, the barn where they stored hay and equipment. Jedediah and a few of the ranch hands were battling the blaze, using buckets of water from the nearby creek to try to contain the fire. But it was a losing battle. The barn was engulfed in flames, the heat intense, the smoke suffocating. Laurie jumped from her horse and ran towards the fire, her heart filled with a mixture of rage and despair. "The Barstows," she shouted, her voice hoarse. "They did this. They're trying to destroy us." Jack and Deputy Thompson joined the effort to fight the fire, but it was clear that the barn was lost. They focused on preventing the flames from spreading to the other buildings, to the main house, to the surrounding grasslands. As the fire raged, Laurie noticed a figure standing on a nearby hill, watching the scene with a smug expression. It was Caleb Barstow, his face flushed with triumph, his eyes gleaming with malice. Laurie's anger reached a boiling point. She grabbed a rifle from one of the ranch hands and started towards Caleb, her intent clear. Jack saw her and quickly intercepted her.
"Laurie, no,"
he shouted, his voice urgent. "Don't do it. It's what he wants. He wants you to react, to give him an excuse to." He didn't finish the sentence, but Laurie understood. Caleb Barstow was trying to provoke her, to goad her into making a mistake, to give him a reason to kill her. She lowered the rifle, her hands trembling, her body shaking with rage and frustration. She knew Jack was right. She couldn't let her emotions control her. She had to be smart. She had to be strategic. She had to find a way to defeat the Barstows, to bring them to justice, without resorting to violence. The river of secrets that ran through Whispering Pines was turning red with the flames of the Barstows' hatred. Laurie knew that she was standing at a crossroads, a point of no return. She had to choose her path carefully, had to decide how far she was willing to go to protect her land, her legacy, and the fragile, tentative connection she was forming with Jack Slade. The fire was a symbol, a burning away of the old, but what would rise from the ashes? She didn't know, but she knew she couldn't face it alone. Chapter 11. The Unforgiving Glare of Noon. The aftermath of the fire was a scene of devastation. The barn, once a vital part of the ranch, was reduced to a smoldering pile of ashes and twisted metal. The air was thick with the acrid smell of smoke, a lingering reminder of the Barstows' cruelty. Laurie, her face streaked with soot, her clothes torn and dirty, surveyed the damage with a mixture of despair and determination. The loss of the barn was a significant blow, a setback that would make it even harder to keep the ranch afloat. But she refused to be defeated. She would rebuild. She would recover. She would not let the Barstows win. Deputy Thompson, after inspecting the scene and questioning Jedediah and the ranch hands, confirmed what they already knew. The fire had been deliberately set, most likely by the Barstows or their men. He promised to gather more evidence, to build a case against them, but he also cautioned Laurie that it would be a long and difficult process. The Barstows are powerful, he said, his voice grim. They have influence, they have money, they have people who are afraid to speak out against them. We'll need solid proof, irrefutable evidence, to bring them to justice. Laurie nodded, her resolve hardening. We'll get it, she said, her voice firm. We'll find a way. The following days were a blur of activity, a mixture of rebuilding efforts and investigative work. Laurie and Jack worked tirelessly, repairing fences, tending to the remaining cattle, and trying to salvage what they could from the burned-out barn. They also continued to gather information, to piece together the puzzle of the Barstows' crimes, to uncover the truth about Thomas's death. One afternoon, while riding near the north pasture, they discovered a small, hidden campsite tucked away in a secluded grove of trees. The campsite was clearly recent, with signs of recent occupation, a smoldering fire pit, discarded food scraps, and several sets of footprints. Jack examined the footprints carefully, his eyes narrowed in concentration. These are not our men's footprints, he said. And they're not the Barstows either. At least, not the ones I've seen. Laurie felt a chill run down her spine. Who else would be out here? She asked, her voice trembling. Who else would have a reason to? She didn't finish the sentence, but the implication was clear. There was someone else involved, someone they didn't know, someone who was working with the Barstows or perhaps even controlling them. They searched the campsite thoroughly, looking for any clue that might reveal the identity of the mysterious visitors. They found a small, intricately carved wooden box, hidden beneath a pile of rocks. Inside the box, they found a collection of letters, written in a spidery hand, detailing a conspiracy to acquire land in the area, to drive out the smaller ranchers, to consolidate power and wealth. The letters were not signed, but they contained references to specific events, to specific people, that pointed to a connection with a wealthy and influential businessman in Denver, a man named Marcus Thorne. Thorne was known for his ruthless tactics, his insatiable greed, and his willingness to use any means necessary to achieve his goals. Laurie's heart sank. This was bigger, far bigger, than she had ever imagined. She was not just fighting the Barstow brothers, she was fighting a powerful, well-connected man who had the resources and the influence to crush her without a second thought. The unforgiving glare of the noon sun seemed to mock her, to highlight the hopelessness of her situation. She felt a wave of despair wash over her, a sense of being overwhelmed by the forces arrayed against her. Jack placed a comforting hand on her shoulder. "We're not alone, Laurie," he said, his voice firm. "We have each other. We have Jedediah. We have Deputy Thompson. And we have the truth. We'll fight this together. We'll expose Thorne, We'll bring him down, just like we'll bring down the Barstows." His words, his presence, his unwavering support gave her a renewed sense of hope, a flicker of courage in the face of overwhelming odds. She looked into his eyes and saw not just determination, but also a deep, abiding affection, a connection that had grown stronger with each passing day, with each shared challenge. The heat of the day was intense, but the heat between them, the unspoken promise of something more, was even stronger. It was a dangerous game, but she was no longer sure she could, or even wanted to, resist. Chapter 12. A bargain struck in Twilight's embrace. The discovery of the letters implicating Marcus Thorne changed everything. It elevated the conflict from a local land dispute to a conspiracy that reached far beyond the dusty plains of Whispering Pines. Laurie and Jack knew they needed a new strategy, a way to expose Thorne's involvement without putting themselves in even greater danger. They decided to take the letters to Sheriff Harding in Silver Creek, hoping that he would have the resources and the authority to investigate Thorne. They also decided to keep the discovery of the campsite and the letters a secret, even from Deputy Thompson, until they knew for sure who they could trust. The ride to Silver Creek was filled with a tense silence, their thoughts consumed by the implications of their discovery. They were playing a dangerous game, pitting themselves against a powerful and ruthless enemy. But they were also driven by a sense of justice, by a determination to uncover the truth about Thomas's death and to protect their land and their way of life. Sheriff Harding, after examining the letters and listening to their story, agreed that the evidence pointed to a larger conspiracy, possibly involving Marcus Thorne. He promised to contact his colleagues in Denver to initiate a discreet investigation into Thorne's activities. But he also warned them that it would be a long and difficult process, that Thorne was a man with many connections, a man who knew how to cover his tracks. "You need to be careful," he said, his voice grave. "Thorne is not a man to be trifled with. He has a reputation for ruthlessness, for getting what he wants, no matter the cost." Laurie and Jack nodded, their resolve hardening. They knew the risks, but they were not deterred. They had come too far, lost too much, to back down now. Before leaving Silver Creek, Laurie and Jack decided to spend another night at the hotel, to rest and regroup before returning to the dangers of Whispering Pines. The hotel, with its familiar comforts, offered a brief respite from the tension and anxiety that had become their constant companions. That evening, as the sun began to set, casting long shadows across the town, they found themselves on the hotel balcony, their conversation subdued, their thoughts heavy with the challenges ahead. "I'm afraid, Jack," Laurie admitted, her voice barely a whisper. "Afraid of what Thorne might do, afraid of losing everything." Jack reached out, his hand gently covering hers. His touch sent a familiar warmth through her, a reassurance that she was not alone in this fight. "We'll face it together, Laurie," he said, his voice firm. "We always do." He drew her closer, and for a moment, she leaned into him, seeking comfort in his strength, in his presence. The twilight embraced them, casting a soft, romantic glow around them, blurring the lines between their shared mission and their growing feelings for each other. "I don't know what I would have done without you, Jack," Laurie said, her voice choked with emotion. "You've given me hope, you've given me strength." She didn't finish the sentence, but the unspoken words hung in the air between them, a testament to the bond that had formed between them, a bond forged in the crucible of danger and adversity. He cupped her face in his hands, his thumbs gently stroking her cheeks. His eyes, the color of dark whiskey, held a depth of feeling that both captivated and unnerved her. "Laurie," he said, his voice husky. He hesitated, searching for the right words, struggling to express the emotions that were swirling within him. He had been a loner for so long, a man haunted by his past, a man who had closed himself off to the possibility of love and connection. But Laurie, with her courage, her resilience, her unwavering spirit, had broken through his defenses, had awakened feelings within him that he had thought long dead. He leaned in and kissed her, a kiss that was both tender and passionate, a kiss that spoke of longing, of desire, of a connection that defied logic and reason. It was a kiss that sealed a bargain, an unspoken agreement to face the future together, whatever it might hold. A bargain struck not in ink, but in the twilight's embrace, a pact sealed with a kiss. The dangers were still there, the threats still loomed, but now they had something to fight for, something more than just land and legacy. They had each other, and in that moment, surrounded by the fading light and the growing darkness, they found a strength, a hope that neither of them had dared to dream of before. Chapter 13. Whispers of Treachery on the Wind. Returning to Whispering Pines, Lori and Jack felt a heightened sense of unease. The ranch, once a sanctuary, now felt like a target, exposed and vulnerable. They knew that Thorn, through the Barstows, would be watching them, waiting for an opportunity to strike. They shared the information about Thorn with Jedediah, carefully omitting the details about the letters and the campsite, wanting to protect their source and their strategy. Jedediah, his face grim, listened intently, his years of experience making him acutely aware of the danger they faced. Thorn is a snake, he said, his voice low and hard. He'll use any means necessary to get what he wants. We need to be prepared for anything. They strengthened the defenses of the ranch, posting guards, setting traps, and preparing for a possible attack. They also continued to gather information, to monitor the Barstow's activities, to look for any sign of Thorn's involvement. Deputy Thompson, still ostensibly investigating the fire and the cattle rustling, seemed increasingly frustrated by his lack of progress. He was hampered by the local corruption, by the fear that gripped the townsfolk, by the subtle obstructionism of Sheriff Thompson. One evening, as Lori and Jack were reviewing their plans, they received a visit from an unexpected source, Silas Barstow, the younger of the two brothers. He arrived alone, unarmed, his face pale and drawn, his demeanor hesitant and nervous. "I need to talk to you," he said, his voice trembling. "It's about everything. About my brother, about Thorn, about Thomas." Lori and Jack exchanged a surprised look. They had considered Silas to be just as guilty as his brother, just as complicit in the crimes that had been committed. But his appearance, his demeanor, suggested something different. They invited him inside, their suspicion warring with a flicker of hope that he might be a source of valuable information. Silas, his hands shaking, told them a story that confirmed their worst fears and revealed a level of treachery they had not anticipated. He spoke of his brother's growing obsession with acquiring the McGraw land, of his partnership with Marcus Thorne, of the plan to drive Lori off her ranch by any means necessary. He also confessed to his own involvement, admitting that he had been pressured by his brother, intimidated by Thorne, and coerced into participating in the cattle rustling and the intimidation tactics. But he claimed that he had never wanted to hurt anyone, that he had never agreed to the plan to kill Thomas. "Caleb, he did it," Silas said, his voice choked with emotion. "He killed Thomas. He ambushed him, shot him in the back. He made it look like an accident, but it wasn't. It was murder." Lori felt a wave of grief and rage wash over her. She had suspected the truth, but hearing it confirmed, hearing the details of Thomas's brutal death, filled her with a pain that was almost unbearable. Jack placed a comforting hand on her arm, his eyes filled with empathy and anger. "We know, Silas," he said, his voice calm but firm. "We know what your brother did, and we're going to make him pay." Silas looked at them, his eyes pleading. "I can help you," he said. "I can testify against my brother, against Thorne. I can tell you everything I know. But I need your protection. They'll kill me if they find out I've talked to you." The whispers of treachery on the wind were now a howling gale. Lori and Jack faced a difficult decision. Could they trust Silas? Was he genuinely remorseful? Or was this a trap, a ploy to lure them into a false sense of security? The stakes were higher than ever, and the line between friend and foe was blurred by the swirling dust of deceit and betrayal. They had a potential ally, but accepting his help was a gamble that could cost them everything. Chapter 14. The Ghosts of Gold Canyon. The decision to trust Silas weighed heavily on Lori and Jack. They spent hours debating the risks and benefits, weighing the potential value of his information against the possibility of a trap. Jedediah, ever cautious, was skeptical, warning them that Silas could be playing them, leading them into an ambush. "He's a Barstow," Jedediah argued, his voice firm. "They're all snakes. You can't trust any of them." Lori, her heart torn between her desire for justice and her fear of betrayal, was hesitant. She had been deceived before, had trusted the wrong people, and the consequences had been devastating. Jack, however, saw something in Silas's desperation, in his willingness to betray his own brother, that resonated with him. He recognized the flicker of remorse, the yearning for redemption, that mirrored his own inner struggles. "I believe him," Jack said, his voice confident. "I think he's telling the truth. He's scared, he's desperate, and he wants to make amends for his mistakes." They decided to take a calculated risk. They would accept Silas's offer of help, but they would also take precautions, keeping him under close watch, protecting him from his brother and from Thorne's men. Silas provided them with detailed information about the Barstow's operations, about Thorne's involvement, about the location of the stolen cattle. He also revealed a crucial piece of evidence, a ledger, hidden in a secret compartment in Caleb's desk, that documented all of their illegal activities, including the payments from Thorne. The ledger was the key, the irrefutable proof they needed to bring down both the Barstows and Thorne. But getting it would be dangerous. Caleb's ranch was heavily guarded, and they would be walking into a trap if they simply rode in and demanded it. They devised a plan, a daring and risky maneuver that relied on stealth, deception, and a bit of luck. They would use Silas as a decoy, sending him back to his brother with a fabricated story, a tale of betrayal and escape, designed to lure Caleb into a false sense of security. While Caleb was distracted, Lori and Jack would infiltrate the ranch, locate the ledger, and retrieve it. They chose Gold Canyon, a remote, desolate area known for its abandoned mines and treacherous terrain, as the location for the rendezvous. It was a place where secrets were buried, where fortunes were lost, where the ghosts of the past still lingered. As the sun began to set, casting long shadows across the canyon walls, they set their plan in motion. Silas, his face pale but resolute, rode towards his brother's ranch, carrying the fabricated story, playing the role of the repentant traitor. Lori and Jack, accompanied by Jedediah, followed at a distance, using the cover of darkness and their knowledge of the terrain to conceal their movements. They were walking into a dangerous situation, a potential ambush, but they were driven by a sense of justice, by a determination to uncover the truth and to bring the guilty to account. The ghosts of Gold Canyon seemed to watch them, their silent presence a reminder of the stakes involved, of the lives that had been lost, of the fortunes that had been squandered. The air was thick with tension, with the unspoken fear of what lay ahead. They were venturing into the heart of darkness, seeking to expose the truth and to bring light to a conspiracy that had cast a long shadow over Whispering Pines. And as they rode deeper into the canyon, they knew that they were not just fighting for their land, for their legacy, but for their very survival. The echoes of the past were merging with the dangers of the present, and the outcome was far from certain. Chapter 15. A Reckoning Under a Blood Moon. The air in Gold Canyon crackled with tension, the silence broken only by the rustling of the wind and the occasional cry of a night bird. A blood moon, large and ominous, hung low in the sky, casting an eerie red glow over the desolate landscape. It was a fitting backdrop for the showdown that was about to unfold. Lori, Jack, and Jedediah concealed themselves among the rocks and shadows, their eyes fixed on the rendezvous point, a small clearing near the entrance to an abandoned mine. They had arrived early, giving themselves time to scout the area, to prepare for any eventuality. Silas, playing his part, rode into the clearing, his demeanor nervous and hesitant. He was met by Caleb and two of his men, their faces grim, their hands resting on their weapons. "You're late," Caleb growled, his voice filled with suspicion. "What took you so long?" Silas recounted the fabricated story, his voice trembling slightly, but holding firm. He told of his escape from Lori and Jack, of his realization that he had been on the wrong side, of his desire to make amends. Caleb listened intently, his eyes narrowed, his expression unreadable. He was a cunning and ruthless man, not easily fooled. But Silas's performance was convincing, his fear genuine, his desperation palpable. While Caleb was distracted, Laurie and Jack, moving silently and swiftly, began their approach to the Barstow Ranch house, a short distance from the clearing. Jedediah remained behind, covering their retreat, his rifle ready. They reached the house without incident, finding it surprisingly unguarded. Caleb, confident in his position, had taken most of his men with him to the rendezvous, leaving only a skeleton crew behind. Laurie and Jack slipped inside, their movements careful and deliberate. They found Caleb's office, a small, cluttered room filled with papers, ledgers, and the accumulated detritus of a life of crime. They located the secret compartment in Caleb's desk, a cleverly concealed panel that opened with a hidden latch. Inside, they found the ledger, a thick, leather-bound book filled with incriminating entries, documenting the illegal transactions, the payments from Thorne, the details of the conspiracy. As they were leaving the office, they heard a commotion outside, shouts and gunshots erupting from the direction of the clearing. The rendezvous had gone wrong. Silas's deception had been discovered, or perhaps Caleb had never believed him in the first place. Laurie and Jack knew they had to get out, and fast. They slipped out of the house, their hearts pounding, the ledger clutched tightly in Laurie's hand. They ran towards the clearing, where a fierce gunfight was underway. They saw Jedediah, firing from behind a rock, his rifle spitting lead. They saw Silas, lying wounded on the ground, his body riddled with bullets. They saw Caleb, his face contorted with rage, firing at Jedediah. Jack raised his pistol and fired, hitting Caleb in the shoulder, spinning him around. Caleb turned, his eyes blazing with hatred, and fired at Jack, the bullet grazing his arm. Laurie, seeing Jack wounded, reacted instinctively. She raised the ledger, and using it like shield to protect herself, ran toward Caleb, her eyes filled with a cold rage, screamed, "This is for Thomas." The confrontation under the blood moon reached its climax. The air was thick with the smell of gunpowder, the sounds of gunfire, and shouting echoing through the canyon. The reckoning had come, a violent and chaotic clash between justice and lawlessness, between love and betrayal, between the past and the future. The red glow of the moon seemed to reflect the blood that was being spilled, the lives that were being lost, in the desperate struggle for control of Whispering Pines. Who would survive, and what would remain, was yet to be seen, but the echoes of this night would forever resonate in the heart of the canyon. Chapter 16. The Serpent's Kiss, the Lion's Roar. The chaos of the gunfight swirled around Laurie, Jack, and Jedediah. Laurie, fueled by adrenaline and a burning desire for revenge, charged towards Caleb, the ledger held before her like a shield. The sound of bullets whizzing past her, the acrid smell of gunpowder, the cries of the wounded all faded into a background blur as she focused on her target. Caleb, surprised by her sudden attack, stumbled backward, his eyes wide with a mixture of rage and disbelief. He raised his pistol to fire, but Laurie was too quick. She slammed the ledger into his face, the heavy book connecting with a sickening thud. Caleb staggered, his nose broken, blood streaming down his face. He dropped his pistol, clutching his injured face, his eyes filled with pain and fury. Jack, recovering from his own wound, fired another shot, hitting Caleb in the leg, sending him sprawling to the ground. Jedediah, seeing his opportunity, rushed forward, disarming Caleb and pinning him to the earth. The remaining Barstow men, seeing their leader defeated, surrendered, throwing down their weapons and raising their hands in submission. The gunfight was over, the silence that followed deafening in its contrast to the preceding violence. Laurie, her chest heaving, her body trembling, stood over Caleb, the ledger still clutched in her hand. She looked down at him, her eyes filled with a mixture of contempt and sorrow. "It's over, Caleb," she said, her voice cold and hard. "You've lost. You'll pay for what you've done, for what you did to Thomas." Caleb, his face contorted with pain and hatred, spat at her feet. "You haven't won, McGraw," he snarled. "Thorne will finish what I started. He'll destroy you, He'll take everything you have. Lori ignored his threat, her attention focused on Silas, who lay bleeding on the ground nearby. She rushed to his side, kneeling beside him, her heart filled with a mixture of grief and gratitude. "Silas," she said, her voice trembling. "Are you all right?" Silas, his face pale and drawn, managed a weak smile. "I tried," he whispered. "I tried to make things right." He coughed, a bloody froth bubbling from his lips. He reached out, his hand weakly grasping Lori's. Tell them the truth," he whispered. "Tell them I'm sorry." His hand went limp, his eyes closing. Silas Barstow, the reluctant traitor, the man who had sought redemption, was dead. The serpent's kiss of betrayal had claimed another victim, but the lion's roar of justice was finally echoing through the canyon. Lori, her heart heavy with grief for Silas and for the loss of her husband, felt a surge of determination. She would not let their sacrifices be in vain. She would expose Thorn. She would bring him to justice. She would ensure that the truth prevailed. Jack, his arm bandaged by Jedediah, came to her side, his presence a comforting weight, a source of strength and support. He placed a hand on her shoulder, his eyes filled with empathy and understanding. "We did it, Lori," he said, his voice soft. "We got the ledger. We stopped the Barstows. We're one step closer to bringing Thorn down." Lori nodded, her gaze fixed on the blood moon hanging low in the sky. The eerie red glow seemed to illuminate the scene, to highlight the cost of their victory, the sacrifices that had been made. The battle was won, but the war was far from over. Thorn was still out there, a powerful and ruthless enemy, waiting in the shadows. But Lori McGraw, the widow of Whispering Pines, was no longer afraid. She had faced her demons, she had confronted her enemies, and she had emerged stronger, more determined, more resilient than ever before. And she had Jack Slade by her side, a man who had become her partner, her protector, her confidant, and perhaps something more. The kiss of the serpent had been deadly, but the roar of the lion, her roar, would not be silenced. Chapter 17. Where Hope Withers and Courage Blooms. The days following the confrontation at Gold Canyon were a mixture of grief, relief, and renewed determination. Lori, Jack, and Jedediah returned to Whispering Pines, carrying the body of Silas Barstow, a testament to the cost of their victory. They buried him on a quiet hillside, overlooking the ranch, a simple wooden cross marking his grave. Deputy Thompson, arriving on the scene shortly after the gunfight, took custody of Caleb Barstow and his men, promising to transport them to Silver Creek to face charges. He also took possession of the ledger, the crucial piece of evidence that would, hopefully, bring down Marcus Thorn. The news of the Barstows' arrest and Silas's death spread quickly through Redemption, creating a mixture of shock, fear, and a cautious sense of hope. The townsfolk, long intimidated by the Barstows' power, began to emerge from the shadows, offering their support to Lori, expressing their gratitude for her courage and determination. Lori, however, found little solace in their praise. The victory felt hollow, overshadowed by the loss of Silas, by the lingering grief for Thomas, by the knowledge that Thorn was still at large. She felt a deep sense of weariness, a bone-deep exhaustion that seemed to seep into her very soul. Jack, ever watchful, ever supportive, recognized her struggle. He stayed by her side, offering a quiet presence, a comforting hand, a listening ear. He understood her pain, her grief, her sense of isolation. He had walked a similar path, had carried his own burdens of loss and regret. One evening, as they sat on the porch, watching the sun set over the vast expanse of the ranch, Lori finally broke down, the tears she had been holding back for so long flowing freely. "I don't know if I can do this, Jack," she sobbed, her voice choked with emotion. "I'm tired. I'm scared. I miss Thomas so much." Jack gently pulled her into his arms, holding her close, his embrace a haven of comfort and support. He didn't offer empty platitudes, didn't try to minimize her pain. He simply held her, letting her cry, letting her release the pent-up emotions that had been consuming her. I know, Lori, he whispered, his voice soft and soothing. I know it's hard, but you're not alone. I'm here. We're in this together. As she cried, he stroked her hair, his touch gentle and reassuring. He spoke of his own losses, of his own struggles, of the long and difficult journey he had taken to find some semblance of peace. He shared his pain, his vulnerability, his humanity, creating a bond of shared experience that transcended their differences, their pasts, their uncertainties. Where hope had withered under the harsh glare of loss and betrayal, courage began to bloom, nurtured by the shared strength, by the unspoken promise of a future together. The tears eventually subsided, replaced by a quiet resolve, a renewed determination to see this fight through to the end. Thank you, Jack, Lori said, her voice still shaky, but filled with a newfound strength. Thank you for everything. He smiled, a gentle, understanding smile that reached his eyes and softened his features. We'll get through this, Lori, he said. Together. As the darkness gathered, they remained on the porch, their hands clasped together, their silence filled with a quiet understanding, a shared hope, a budding love that was slowly blossoming in the midst of adversity. The challenges ahead were still daunting, the threat of thorns still loomed, but they had found something precious, something worth fighting for in each other. And that, they knew, was a strength that no enemy could ever diminish. Chapter 18. The Long Road to Redemption. Weeks turned into months, and the slow, arduous process of bringing Marcus Thorne to justice began. Sheriff Harding, working with his colleagues in Denver, launched a full-scale investigation into Thorne's business dealings, uncovering a web of corruption, bribery, and illegal land acquisitions that stretched far beyond Whispering Pines. The ledger, recovered from Caleb Barstow's office, proved to be the key piece of evidence, providing irrefutable proof of Thorne's involvement in the conspiracy to drive Lori off her land, and his complicity in Thomas's murder. Lori and Jack, meanwhile, focused on rebuilding Whispering Pines, on restoring the ranch to its former glory. They repaired fences, rebuilt the barn, and slowly began to replenish their herd, with the help of neighboring ranchers who, inspired by Lori's courage and resilience, offered their support. The town of Redemption, too, began to undergo a transformation. With the Barstows gone and Thorne's influence waning, a new sense of hope and optimism began to emerge. The corrupt Sheriff Thompson was replaced by a more honest and dedicated lawman, and the townsfolk, no longer living in fear, began to work together to build a better future. Lori and Jack's relationship, forged in the crucible of danger and adversity, continued to deepen. They spent hours working side by side, their hands often brushing, their eyes meeting in shared understanding, their conversations filled with a quiet intimacy that spoke of a growing love. They also spoke of the future, of their hopes and dreams, of the possibility of building a life together, of creating a new legacy on the land that had been so hard-won. But they also acknowledged the challenges that still lay ahead, the uncertainties that still lingered, the shadows of the past that still haunted them. One evening, as they were walking along the creek bed, the setting sun painting the sky in hues of orange and purple, Jack stopped and turned to Lori, his eyes filled with a mixture of tenderness and apprehension. Lori, he said, his voice hesitant. I need to tell you something. Something about my past, something I should have told you a long time ago. Lori, her heart filled with a mixture of anticipation and fear, nodded, her gaze unwavering. I'm listening, Jack, she said, her voice soft. He told her the full story of his life before he came to Whispering Pines, of his time as a lawman, of his pursuit of the man who had killed Sarah, of the years he had spent wandering, searching for justice, for redemption, for a way to escape the ghosts of his past. He spoke of his guilt, of his self-blame, of the burden he had carried for so long. He spoke of his fear of letting anyone get close to him, of his fear of losing someone else he cared for. Lori listened, her heart aching for him, for the pain he had endured, for the scars he carried, both visible and invisible. She understood his reticence, his hesitation, his fear of vulnerability. Thank you for telling me, Jack, she said, her voice filled with empathy and understanding. "It doesn't change anything. It only makes me understand you better and love you more." The words, spoken softly but with a profound sincerity, hung in the air between them, a testament to the depth of their feelings, to the bond that had formed between them. The long road to redemption was not yet over, but they were walking it together, hand in hand, their hearts intertwined, their futures intertwined. And in that moment, surrounded by the beauty of the setting sun and the quiet serenity of whispering pines, they found a peace, a hope that neither of them had dared to dream of before. The past was still there, but it no longer held them captive. They were moving forward, towards a new beginning, a new life, a new love. Chapter 19. Beyond the reach of yesterday's pain. The news of Marcus Thorne's arrest came as a wave of relief, washing over Lori and Jack like a cleansing rain. The long investigation, fueled by the evidence from the ledger and the testimony of numerous witnesses, had finally culminated in the apprehension of the man who had orchestrated so much pain and suffering. Thorne, stripped of his power and influence, was brought to Silver Creek to face charges of conspiracy, bribery, and murder. The trial was a lengthy and arduous process, drawing attention from across the territory, exposing the depths of Thorne's corruption and the extent of his crimes. Lori, Jack, and Jedediah testified, recounting their experiences, their struggles, their losses. They faced Thorne in the courtroom, their eyes meeting his, their voices unwavering as they spoke the truth, as they demanded justice for Thomas, for Silas, for all those who had suffered at his hands. The jury, after days of deliberation, returned a verdict of guilty on all counts. Thorne, his face pale and drawn, his eyes devoid of their former arrogance, was sentenced to life in prison, a fitting punishment for the man who had believed himself to be above the law. For Lori, the verdict brought a sense of closure, a feeling that justice had finally been served. But it did not erase the pain, did not bring back Thomas, did not fully heal the wounds that had been inflicted. It was a significant step on the long road to recovery, but it was not the end of the journey. With Thorne behind bars and the Barstows defeated, Whispering Pines began to thrive once more. The ranch, rebuilt and revitalized, became a symbol of resilience, of hope, of the enduring spirit of the frontier. Lori and Jack, their relationship strengthened by the shared trials they had overcome, continued to build their life together, their love deepening with each passing day. They worked side by side, their hands often brushing, their eyes meeting in shared understanding, their conversations filled with a quiet intimacy that spoke of a future filled with promise. One spring morning, as they were riding across the sun-drenched mesa, overseeing the new growth of the grass and the burgeoning herd of cattle, Jack stopped his horse and turned to Lori, his eyes filled with a love that was both profound and enduring. "Lori," he said, his voice husky with emotion, "I love you. I love you more than words can say. You've given me a new life, a new purpose, a new hope. Will you marry me?" Lori, her heart overflowing with joy, her eyes shining with tears of happiness, nodded, her voice choked with emotion. "Yes, Jack," she whispered. "Yes, I will." They embraced, their kiss a seal of their commitment, a promise of a future together, a future beyond the reach of yesterday's pain. They had found love in the midst of adversity, had forged a bond that could not be broken, had created a new legacy on the land that had witnessed so much sorrow and so much struggle. They were married in a simple ceremony at the ranch, surrounded by their friends, their neighbors, the people who had stood by them through thick and thin. Jedediah, his eyes filled with tears of joy, gave Lori away, his gruff exterior masking a heart filled with love and pride. As Lori and Jack stood before the preacher, their hands clasped together, their eyes locked in a gaze of unwavering love, they knew that they had found something truly special, something that transcended the hardships of the past, something that would endure for all time. They had found a home, a family, a love that was as vast and as enduring as the western sky above them. The pain of yesterday was still a memory, but it no longer defined them. They were moving forward, together, into a future filled with hope, with promise, with a love that had been forged in the fires of adversity and tempered by the gentle rains of redemption. Chapter 20. The final confrontation of hearts and horizons. Years passed, and Whispering Pines flourished under Lori and Jack's loving care. The ranch, once a symbol of loss and struggle, became a testament to their resilience, their love, and their unwavering commitment to each other and to the land. Children came, filling the ranch house with laughter and joy, their presence a constant reminder of the new life, the new hope that had blossomed from the ashes of the past. Lori and Jack, their hair now streaked with silver, their faces etched with the lines of time and experience, remained deeply in love, their bond strengthened by the shared trials they had overcome, by the quiet joys of their everyday life, by the unwavering support they offered each other. They often rode together to the crest of the hill overlooking the ranch, where they could survey the vast expanse of their land, the rolling hills, the winding creek, the thriving herd of cattle. It was a place of peace, of reflection, of gratitude for all that they had been given, for all that they had built together. One crisp autumn afternoon, as they sat on their horses, watching the sun set over the distant mountains, painting the sky in hues of fiery orange and deep purple, Lori turned to Jack, her eyes filled with a love that had only deepened with time. "Remember that first day," she said, her voice soft with memory, "when you rode into redemption, a stranger with a haunted past and a dangerous smile?" Jack smiled, his eyes crinkling at the corners, his gaze filled with a tenderness that took her breath away. "How could I forget?" he said. "You looked at me like I was the devil himself, but there was something in your eyes, a spark of defiance, a hint of vulnerability, that drew me in." "I was afraid of you," Lori admitted, her voice barely a whisper. "Afraid of what you represented, afraid of letting anyone get close to me again." "And I was afraid of you," Jack confessed, his voice equally soft. "Afraid of what you made me feel, afraid of opening myself up to the possibility of love and loss once more." They were silent for a long moment, their hands clasped together, their hearts beating in unison. The setting sun cast long shadows across the landscape, a reminder of the passage of time, of the challenges they had faced, of the victories they had won. "We've come a long way," Lori said, her voice filled with a quiet awe. "From a widow struggling to hold onto her land and a drifter haunted by his past, to this." Jack nodded, his gaze sweeping across the vast expanse of their ranch, their home, their legacy. "We built this together, Lori," he said. "We built it on love, on trust, on a shared determination to overcome the odds." He leaned over and kissed her, a gentle, tender kiss that spoke of a love that had endured, a love that had deepened, a love that had stood the test of time. It was a kiss that sealed their final confrontation, not with enemies or adversity, but with their own hearts and the vast horizons that stretched before them. They had faced their demons, had confronted their pasts, and had emerged victorious, not unscathed, but stronger, more resilient, more deeply in love than ever before. They had found redemption, not in revenge or retribution, but in each other, in the love that had blossomed in the midst of hardship, in the life they had built together on the land that had once threatened to consume them. The final confrontation was not a battle, but a merging, a blending of two souls who had found solace, strength, and enduring love in each other's arms. And as the sun dipped below the horizon, casting a final, golden glow over Whispering Pines, they knew that their journey, their love story, would continue, as vast and as enduring as the western sky above them. Epilogue. The wind whispered through the cottonwood trees lining the creek bed, carrying the scent of sage and the distant murmur of cattle. Lori stood on the porch of the ranch house, her gaze fixed on the horizon, where the sky met the land in a seamless blend of color and light. She was older now, her hair completely silver, her face etched with the lines of a life well lived, a life filled with both joy and sorrow, with hardship and triumph. Jack was gone, had been for several years, his passing a gentle release from the ravages of time, a peaceful slumber after a long and arduous journey. But she was not alone. The ranch house was filled with the sounds of her children and grandchildren, their laughter and chatter a constant reminder of the legacy she and Jack had built together, the family they created, the love that had endured. She felt a hand on her shoulder and turned to see her eldest granddaughter, Sarah, named after Jack's lost love, standing beside her. Sarah had Laurie's eyes, the color of a stormy sea, and Jack's quiet strength, his unwavering determination. "Grandma," Sarah said, her voice soft with concern. "Are you all right?" Laurie smiled, her heart filled with a warmth that transcended the lingering ache of loss. "I'm fine, sweetheart," she said. "Just remembering." Sarah nodded, her understanding gaze reflecting the wisdom she had inherited from both her grandparents. She had heard the stories, had grown up with the legends of the widow of Whispering Pines and the drifter who had become her protector, her partner, her love. "He loved you very much, Grandma," Sarah said, her voice filled with sincerity. Laurie's eyes filled with tears, tears of both sorrow and gratitude. "I know," she whispered, "and I loved him more than words can say." They stood together in silence, watching the sun rise, painting the sky in hues of pink and gold, a new day dawning over Whispering Pines, a new generation carrying on the legacy of love, of resilience, of unwavering commitment to the land and to each other. Laurie knew that her time was drawing near, that she would soon join Jack in the vast, eternal expanse beyond the horizon. But she was not afraid. She had lived a full life, a life filled with love, with purpose, with meaning. She had faced her demons, had overcome her challenges, and had emerged victorious, not unscathed, but stronger, wiser, more deeply connected to the world around her. She looked at Sarah, at the future that stretched before her, at the legacy that she and Jack had created. And she smiled, a peaceful, contented smile that reflected the enduring power of love, the unwavering strength of the human spirit, the timeless beauty of the western sky. The whispers of the past still lingered, but they were now gentle echoes, reminders of a journey,